our first speaker. I've seen you online already, Jordan, so if you allow me, I will take the chance to introduce you to our audience before you start presenting. Mr. Jordan Beauregard serves as Senior Environmental Security Advisor to the Civil Applications Committee at the U.S. Geological Survey and co-chairs the U.S. Intelligence Community's Environment Security Working Group. In this role, he provides expertise on the integration of climate and environmental data and information for U.S. national security, law enforcement, and defense customers. Trained and certified in defense intelligence analysis, specializing in the intersections between climate and environmental security, Jordan has published expert commentary and presentation on the nexus of environmental, political, economic, and social trends featured in outlets such as Homeland Security Today, Just Security, the Wilson Center's New Security Beat, Modern Warfare Institute, and the United Kingdom's The Wavell Room. Jordan holds a degree in global affairs from George Mason University. He is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Naval War College, and he holds a graduate degree in strategic intelligence from National Intelligence University, the U.S. Intelligence Community sole degree granting research institution. The presentation of Jordan will be accompanied by a few information on top we're going to send via the chat, and there's also information provided how to link up with Jordan in the aftermath of our today's seminar. Jordan, happy to have you with us. We have been talking prior to the seminar. I've been looking at your presentation already, and I'm really much looking forward to share your expertise with you.
Thank you so much, Major. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to present in this forum. If we go to the first slide, we can get right started. So before we get into the substance, I just wanted to thank you again for the opportunity to not only present on this topic, but also to represent it on behalf of a U.S. scientific organization, the U.S. Geological Survey. It is a really important aspect of this topic to ensure that even when we're talking about military issues and national and global security issues, really like climate change that transcend boundaries, that these issues that we're addressing and the way that we're addressing them are based in the latest science. And so hopefully you'll see throughout this presentation how important that these types of scientific and societal partnerships are to military organizations, to military operations, and hopefully to emphasize that military operations can never happen in isolation from these other communities. Next slide, please. First, I just wanted to say that although I am here and am affiliated with the United States Geological Survey, this content is mine. They reflect my own opinions. They do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. Department of the Interior, or any other entity of the United States government. And also, these opinions that I am presenting and this expertise I am presenting is really academic in nature. And so they are absolutely subject to change based on the integration of new information and different interpretations of the information I may be presenting, as well as different methodological approaches that I may not have considered. And so I'm really looking forward to the discussion portion where we can have these types of conversations. Next slide. Before we can get into the substance of how climate change will impact military operations and security, we have to make sure that we're understanding what climate change is. And so I apologize if this seems a little bit introductory or rudimentary, but you'd be surprised even in my field with people who are actually responsible for covering these topics who still do not necessarily use the terms correctly. And this can affect how certain aspects of this topic are covered. And so fundamentally, the difference between weather, climate, and climate change is really a matter of time, a measure of time. And so weather is those short-term atmospheric conditions at a particular place or region. Climate is the average of those short-term weather conditions over a longer period of time, usually measured in several decades. And climate change refers to an overall trend in that climate, in that long-term average of weather over several decades as well. And so you're looking at an overall change in the average weather conditions of a particular area, and these types of trends are typically statistically observable. Next slide. Thank you so much. Yes, almost there. Perfect. So this is a slide from a colleague that I worked with, and a graphic that was produced by Neil Hayes and published by Imam Ghosh from Visual Capitalist that really showcases how the temperature of the planet has changed over the last 150 years or so. And what we are seeing, and the point of showing this particular temperature chart here is that the global average temperature relative to that pre-industrial period of around 1850 to 1900 has significantly increased to over 1.3 to about 1.3 degrees Celsius. And so we started to see this really severe change happen in earnest around the mid 1990s, but with the hottest years on record happening just within the last few years. And so the importance that I want to emphasize here is that a lot of this climate change that we are seeing is being driven by this overall temperature increase. Next slide. And the reason for this temperature increase is most attributed unequivocally and with absolute attribution to human activity. And I'll go in, so I wanted to make sure that this is stressed here. In all of the models you will see from any of the climate reports that are coming out, whether it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the United Nations, the United States National Climate Assessment, or any of our counterpart national climate assessments in countries worldwide, they account for other natural variabilities as well, like solar and volcanic activity. And even with even when accounting for those factors and any margin of error in calculating the data, human activity is the predominant cause of this temperature increase as a result of greenhouse gas emissions that trap heat on the planet and warm the different aspects of the Earth's climate system. Next slide. As far as what climate change is, there are many different definitions. And so I presented one in just a few slides ago that essentially says it's the average change in the average weather conditions in a particular area over several decades. But the purpose of me showing this particular slide here is these are definitions that come from diplomatic organizations, other scientific organizations, and defense organizations. And the difference you'll notice in these particular slides, if you have the chance to read them, but I'm not going to go through them too much in the interest of time, is how differently they will attribute the climate change definition to human activity. The first definition explicitly says human activity, whereas others refer predominantly to both human and natural activity, and others just simply refer to the changing of the average weather conditions. And so this is an important characteristic because in a lot of defense-related communities, it doesn't necessarily matter whether climate is human caused or not. It'll have impacts anyway. Next slide. It's also important to note that there is an overall difference between a climate change and what is known as global change. And so this definition comes from the US Global Change Research Program, which is the United States legally required authority to coordinate science associated with climate and other Earth system changes. And global change includes climate change, but it also includes other critical drivers of environmental change that could interact or cascade with climate change. This is things like land use, the alteration of the water cycle, changes in different biogeochemical processes, and biodiversity. So this is this is really important to factor in when recognizing climate security. If we could go to the next slide. Before going into the climate security discussion, I just wanted to make sure that we understand a couple key aspects of climate change going forward based on some of the information I had presented about it. The first thing I want to emphasize is I know that there's some part of today's conversation that will focus on the impact of climate change on future military operations. But my first point I want to mention is that climate change is not just a future problem. The future will see more extreme manifestations of climate change, but damaging effects of climate change are already happening now, of both climate change caused by humans and of course natural climate variability that is happening, and they're having damaging effects now for populations worldwide, even in developed countries. Some of the contemporary impacts that result from climate change, some of the contemporary impacts that we're seeing around the world are the result of climate changes that have already happened over the last several decades. And so this is just a taste of what will come in the future, but it means that we still have some degree of time to prevent some of the worst of it. The second point I want to emphasize is that yes, climate produces impacts regardless of whether or not we account for human attribution. Human attribution, right, is the main culprit of the modern phenomenon of climate change and why we're talking about it today. And human attribution is what we can control the most. So yes, climate produces impacts regardless of whether or not people believe or prioritize the human attribution aspect of it. But human attribution, given that it is the main culprit of this contemporary change, it's also what we can control the most, politically, economically, socially, and infrastructurally. The third thing is perhaps an interesting way of putting it, is that climate change is not the problem. This came from a colleague of mine who really put this very eloquently. The Earth's climate system, the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, and the geosphere, it's designed to work to distribute the amount of heat energy on the planet. The sun sends energy in, and the greenhouse gases that exist in the atmosphere keep that heat energy, keep some of it on Earth, and then those different systems send it all around through their various currents and atmospheric and different processes to distribute that heat around. Climate change is a natural response to changes in the Earth's heat energy. And so especially in the days where there may have been a little bit more political contention associated with the attribution of climate change, there's often the case where people would say, well, the climate is always changing. Well, that's true. It's a natural response to changes in the Earth's heat energy. The difference in this modern phenomenon of climate change, and the important thing to understand in the context of why it's so security relevant now, is that human emissions and activity are directly influencing increases in the Earth's heat energy on the planet, stressing those different parts of the climate system. So now that it has more heat energy that it needs to distribute to try and balance it out. And the issue is not that climate change is happening. The issue is that human contributions to emissions have accelerated the rate at which climate change has happened. We have seen more warming happen in the last century than we should have seen. We've seen about 1,000 years worth of warming in just a century, and that is very quick in climate-related concerns. The fourth point I want to mention is that climate change has these cascading impacts on natural and human vulnerabilities. And so this is where we get to climate security specifically. So for the next slide, the term climate security is pretty new in a certain context, in the sense that it has been used all the time, but it hasn't necessarily been codified in every single country's legislation or policy. This comes from the National Defense Authorization Act in the United States for fiscal year 2020. It was the first US codified definition of climate security to my knowledge. And essentially, these are the different aspects of climate security that the legislation calls out as climate change impacting. But ultimately, climate change is so complex and it manifests so differently everywhere that it's not necessarily instructive. And so if we go to the next slide, I developed a framework in 2020, about a year after the legislation came out, to better break down and understand the interactive aspects of how climate security manifests itself. And so I call it the three faces of climate security: the environmental face, the human, and the geopolitical. And to understand climate security generally, before we can try and understand it in the context of military operations, which do have unique implications, you have to understand how all of these three faces interact. And so this framework I have been refining since 2020 as it's become more relevant, and I've been reflecting on it more. So some of the parts of this that I'll talk about are a little bit different from how it was originally published, but ultimately is reflected in that content as well, just not as explicitly. And so, and with a little bit more detail. And so the environmental face of climate security are those environmental symptoms that we see resulting from changes in the climate system. So to understand that environmental face, you have to understand what environmental events are happening, whether it's sea level rise, temperature change, natural disasters. Then you have to be able to figure out what aspect of climate change is happening associated with it. So how to attribute it to climate change. Is it attributed to a routine expected variability in the climate? Is it perhaps an extreme of a particular normal or routine variability? Or is it connected to the human attribution that we are talking about? And so while that doesn't necessarily matter in the sense of the impacts ultimately for military operations in particular, it can be important to be able to communicate that, to understand whether or not there's something that militaries can do, societies can do, or other organizations can do to address it. And then we have to understand how the non-climate environmental hazards, whether you're talking about things like wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, deforestation, pollution, could potentially cascade with those climate-related symptoms. The human face of climate security essentially refers to human development in terms of whether of the human condition, how climate and environmental exposure and risk contributes to human development and security, and then ultimately how human beings are adapting to those risks or how they may be contributing to those risks. So actually referring to the human behavior associated with it. The geopolitical may immediately look to you as so only focusing on the international. That's not necessarily the case, because when we want to talk about geopolitical activity, we also have to understand national level activity. And so when I talk about governance and intention, resources and infrastructure, as well as activity like planning, prioritization, and actions, it can apply locally all the way to internationally, and even looking at particular organizations as to whether or not they are capable of interacting in a way that can address climate security. So if we go to the next, so before we go to the next slide, the key point here at the bottom is geographic variability. Everywhere will manifest these different phases differently. So going to the next slide, I wanted to just talk a little bit about military implications. And so when we talk about the military operations, ultimately we're talking about measures of military readiness. And so this is based on definitions I've gotten from publicly available US Department of Defense policy, as well as analysis. Ultimately, in the context of what you see here, readiness is really defined by this idea of whether or not military forces are capable of fighting and meeting the demands of any kind of assigned mission. And interpreted from that very broad definition, the US Congressional Research Service in 2020 had said essentially the assigned missions are conducted to fulfill a national strategy, and that forces have the ability to fight anywhere at any time, and that is where you're measuring particular readiness. If we go to the next slide, ultimately, you're kind of looking at things associated with, and so to kind of understand kind of what that means and where we start to see some of that intersect, I apologize for many who may find this very introductory, but we go to a little bit of military history. And so my Naval War College professors will be really happy that I'm bringing this up right now. The Karl von Clausewitz, from his On War, he says that ultimately there's three elements that interact to affect the outcome of war. And really, I also translate this as there are these three elements interacting as one that also affect whether or not a military is truly ready to actually fight and win, whether it's a very complex threat like climate change or a more traditional national security threat like fighting another military. And so the three elements are passion, chance, and reason. And so scholars have attributed passion, chance, and reason to the people, as in society, the military, and government. And ultimately from this idea that, and so the point of presenting this slide is that when we talk about military readiness, we can't just talk about the military in isolation from society and from the political sector. It's about the interactions between all of them. as is climate security related to the interactions of those different faces. Going to the next slide is just another way of visualizing this. And so all of these aspects have mutual influence on one another in different ways. And so to understand how to apply this to maybe a more analytical framework to conceptualize it, if we go to the next slide, I developed a notional concept of how to understand military implications, or what I call that militaries need their props to be able to understand. And so taking into consideration the interaction of these different elements, you need policy, resources, operations, and partnerships. Militaries rely on all of these aspects to be able to fight, depending on the level of war, on the environment and particular environments for particular durations of time to fulfill a particular objective. And so then if we go to the next slide, this is where we introduce briefly this idea of defense climate security. How do we talk about the extent to which changes in the global, regional, national, and subnational climate conditions and the environmental conditions that could cascade with it could affect the spectrum of defense and military activities? It's not just about the operations, and even operations are not just about the operations themselves. It's about whether or not they're going to achieve policy, whether they have the resources to sustain and complete them, and whether or not there are effective partnerships there. And so what I suggest is a way to merge the climate security 3 phases framework with this props framework that I sort of developed. Going to the next slide, I'll briefly go through a case study that I worked on for in the case of Russia. And so this is just a map of their military districts. Going to the next slide. This is a notional way of conceptualizing and maybe kind of organizing the information that's around. I will say that this is not, peer reviewed. This is not scientifically evaluated as a methodology or anything. But for me, especially working with a lot of national security professionals, this is a really good way, and when it comes to structured analytic techniques, to understand and organize the broad and overwhelming amount of information that exists. And so I do have backup slides that go into the analysis in more detail, but if we go to the next slide, what you kind of first want to do in terms of looking at the defense climate security of a particular country is to look at the 3 phases. First, understand the climate security pictured there. And so when it comes to Russia, there is a lot of climate vulnerabilities that they are experiencing. Their position in the Arctic means that there are temperatures that are increasing 2 to 3 times the global average. They experience wildfire risk. The most recent IPCC report said that in these areas, particularly in Eastern Europe, the temperatures that are rising are going to contribute to the intensity of increased wildfire conditions. And so fire-related warming is going to affect that. That is also those temperatures have also led to thawing permafrost and changes in land integrity, particularly in the Arctic, which covers almost 2/3 of Russia's surface. As far as attribution goes environmentally, there's at least partial attribution of these different climate-related environmental symptoms to both routine aspects of their climate as well as human-caused ones. And as far as non-climatic symptoms, there is pollution, there is logging and deforestation, there are ecological hazards that exist. And so those are some things to keep in mind that could cascade with any impacts of climate-related concerns. Human-wise, Russia has a lot of advanced scientific expertise. They're a very educated society, but there is a degree of health insecurity. There's demographic insecurities associated with the population. Public safety is of interest. There's protests associated with other types of lack of human development conditions. There is a degree of exposure to different climate and environmental conditions. Infrastructure is directly threatened by permafrost, and there have already been indications of that. There's even been thawing permafrost leading to certain types of medical scares. And as far as behavior, there's still a lot of livelihoods that are reliant on these fossil fuels. There's not really too much activism in Russia associated with the environment. And there are some leading climate scientists that have left, especially given the events in Ukraine. Geopolitically, even though Russia is party to all of the various climate treaties that exist, there of course is a degree of political insecurity and repression and low ultimate political will associated with dealing with climate security. And so although Russia has a lot of, technically for the moment, a lot of money and resources, it's very fossil fuel reliant. Ukraine has undoubtedly diverted a lot of the resources away from something that may have gone towards climate or responding to disasters. Russia had turned off and then turned on wildfire detection related monitoring systems. And then activity geopolitically, there's a lot of activity in the Arctic Council that is effectively stalled because of Russia. And even if the other Arctic states kind of work together to deal with to do their own priorities, Russia's a massive player in the Arctic. And so to try and do climate security related work in the Arctic without Russia is very difficult, and it would be very difficult going forward. So that's just a picture of the climate security conditions there. Going to the next slide is where we kind of try to merge this with a lot of the military readiness aspects that I put together. And so again, I do have slides that go into the analysis in more detail, but for the sake of time, I won't go into them. But if anyone has any questions about it, happy to talk about it during the discussion portion. But this is basically using all of the different information that I've seen. This is where I kind of came out with an understanding of Russia's defense climate security picture. And so basically, I can go into that into more detail when I talk about some of the notional key takeaways. But if we go to the next slide, these are just a couple, and it's very small right now, but these are just some of the references and reports from out in the public sphere that kind of guided this analysis that I did in preparation for today. And so these are just some reports and research. And then on the next slide, there are some more press references. And so going to to start to wrap up, I'll go through some of the key takeaways that I got leveraging this defense climate security framework. So going to the next slide. So as far as the first key takeaway, Russia, in fact, seems to have the inherent national and military resources and capabilities to respond to near-term, seasonal, and domestic environmental and climate hazards, and will likely rely on this response capacity for the foreseeable future. So they will rely on their ability to, when needed, when it becomes super difficult for them environmentally, that is when they will marshal resources and direct them in response. But if we go to the next slide, Russia, it appears, lacks the political, economic, military, and diplomatic incentive to prioritize those resources and capabilities towards current and projected environmental and climate conditions. And certainly impacts to the population, its infrastructure, and its operations. And so and this is really for many of the reasons that you see depicted here. I think probably Ukraine is probably one of the biggest, most visible aspects of how that's going to affect Russia's incentive right now. There's been a lot of climate-related action that has been threatened as a result of the geopolitical events there. There's also been a lot of climate action that has been spurred because of it. And but when it comes to understanding Russia's defense climate security, Russia is climate vulnerable. They have resources to adapt to it, but right now they do not have the incentive right now or that outlook to prioritize that at the moment. For the final notional key takeaway on the next slide, left unaddressed, the anticipated intensity and duration of environmental impacts from climate change, compounded with diverted military and political prioritization, could lead to climate change overwhelming or reducing Russia's government and military reactive climate security operations, on which they seem to rely at the moment. Russia's military, like many other militaries, derives from their political directives. And if those political directives do not prioritize any kind of military response to the disaster, even though Russia does in fact have the ability and a robust capability, it seems, to respond using the military in response to natural disaster, given the wildfires they experience every single year. There is evidence that already the war in Ukraine is diverting some of those resources. And this is an open press. And so this is very concerning, given how climate vulnerable they are, and climate conditions do not seem to be changing in that particular part of the region in a way that is positive for them. So going to the next, so in order to summarize everything, just a few things to emphasize. Climate change poses challenges for physical, human, and institutional operating environments for global militaries. Climate change implications for military operations must be understood based not only on how they affect, but also how they are affected by government and human implications for climate change. Military operations should never and cannot ever, if they want to succeed and sustain, be isolated from those political and human related concerns. The capability to be ready for climate security means little in the absence of national and military intention to acknowledge and address it. But even in the absence of political direction, militaries can work on on defense climate security if they truly feel that there's enough resources and capability to do it by understanding and connecting climate change activities to their existing authorities and directives. And this goes for any military around the world. That they can work on these types of these issues by, even if it's not explicitly called out in policy or legislation, if they believe that it is directly connected to succeeding to accomplish their particular authorities. And finally, a particular country, community, region, and frankly, military cannot succeed in this particular issue internationally or domestically without working on not only international partnerships, not even, and certainly, but also civil and military relationships domestically, working with their societies, integrating the scientific community. If you want to be climate security ready, you need all of these parts of society working to support one another, because nothing is happening in isolation, and climate change is one of the key examples to accomplish that. Going to the next slide, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.